Mandy had spent the last 6 years of her life playing the role of the perfect housewife, faithful, patient, and always invisible. Every morning, she woke up before dawn, prepared breakfast, dressed her daughter Annie for preschool, cleaned the entire house, and tended to her wheelchair-bound mother-in-law Susan, who had never once offered a word of thanks. And yet, when Mandy asked her husband, Mike, for living expenses, it felt like groveling before a king. The $1,500 he handed over each month was offered with such disdain you'd think he was granting her a fortune. At first, Mandy tried to rationalize it. He worked hard, he had business expenses, and maybe he just needed space. But that illusion shattered the day Annie tugged at her hand, eyes wide with innocent longing, asking for a slice of cake. Mandy's heart twisted as she whispered, "Mommy doesn't have money right now, sweetheart. Let's wait until Daddy sends it." It was a wake-up call. They weren't poor, far from it. Mike's job paid well, and they lived in a comfortable home in a decent neighborhood. So why did she, his wife, have to beg for cake money? Mandy sent Mike a polite message. "Honey, are you busy? Could you transfer this month's allowance when you get a chance? Annie really wants some cake." The reply came late and without warmth. A voice message dripping with irritation. "Got it. Stop nagging. I'm busy. I'll send it later." But he didn't. Hours passed. Annie got sick, vomiting and diarrhea, and Mandy had to rush her to the hospital without a cent in her account. She called Mike, praying for empathy. Instead, he barked, "Didn't I say I'm busy? Stop bothering me." That night, after borrowing money from a friend to cover the hospital bill, Mandy stood in her kitchen, a hollow ache in her chest. Mike had come home late, offering no apology. Susan, as usual, greeted her with a barrage of criticism. "Lazy woman, no dinner ready? What have you been doing all day?" Mandy swallowed the insult and helped her into the living room, her body moving on autopilot. At dinner, she asked again for the living expenses. Mike looked up from his plate and scoffed. "You women have it easy. No job, no stress. Just sit around all day and wait for handouts." Susan chimed in, "Exactly. My son works like a dog and you just bleed him dry." That was it. The moment Mandy's patience expired, she slammed her plate down and unleashed 6 years of pent-up frustration. "You act like $1,500 is a royal gift. I've given up my job, my life, to care for this household, your mother, your daughter, your meals, your laundry, and you treat me like a beggar?" She turned to Susan, her voice cutting and clear. "You call me lazy? Do you know how much a full-time caregiver costs? $4,000 a month at least. And I do it all for $1,500 and insults." Mike's face flushed. "Mandy, you're being dramatic." But Mandy wasn't done. "No, Mike, I've never been more clear. I'm done. Done asking for money, done being your maid, done taking care of your mother. From now on, we're co-parents. You handle Annie. I'll get a job and rebuild my life." Mike stammered. Susan screamed, but Mandy walked away. That night, Annie crawled into bed beside her and whispered, "Mommy, you were amazing today." Mandy hugged her tightly, tears falling freely. For the first time in years, she felt awake, alive. The next day, Mike came crawling back, check in hand, trying to bribe her back into submission. Mandy laughed. "I wouldn't dare take your money. Otherwise, you'll just keep calling me useless. I'm getting a job. As for this house and your mother, not my problem." And she meant it. Mandy walked into a domestic staffing agency, resume in hand, head held high. Years of managing a household, caring for a paralyzed elder, and raising a child on pennies had taught her more than any office job ever could. She was determined to find work that paid fairly and valued her contribution. Meanwhile, Mike's world began to unravel. Without Mandy, the house fell into disarray. Susan became a burden he could no longer ignore. And Annie? Mandy made sure to drop her off at Mike's office that afternoon. Your turn, she said with a smile. Welcome to equal partnership. Mike stared at his daughter, unsure what to do. But Mandy was already out the door, on her way to her second interview of the day. Not for validation, not for revenge, but for freedom. This wasn't just a turning point, it was the start of her second life. Mike's face twisted in disbelief, as if the notion of me having value outside of servitude was completely alien to him. But I wasn't seeking his validation anymore. That night, I sat Annie down and explained gently, "Mommy's going to start working soon. It means I won't always be at home like before, but I promise I'll still be here for you when you need me." Her small arms wrapped around my neck as she whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mommy." That sentence alone gave me more strength than any paycheck ever could, and so began my transformation. Not from wife to worker, but from someone others defined into someone who defined herself. My first few job leads came from a domestic staffing agency. It was humbling to go from a woman who once managed an entire household to someone applying to clean other people's homes. But what Mike and his mother had treated as invisible labor, the outside world valued with dollars and dignity. I passed the training evaluations with flying colors, not because I was special, but because life had already trained me through hardship. Cooking, scheduling, elder care, conflict resolution, I'd done it all, unpaid, for 6 years. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same work that got me scorned at home now earned me genuine appreciation elsewhere. It reminded me of stories I'd heard from women in support groups, brilliant, educated, but burned out by invisible labor. There was Helen, a former executive assistant who got married young and left work for family. After her divorce, she built a successful event planning company using the same skills that once kept PTA meetings afloat. Or Shari, who started a home bakery after her husband belittled her hobby. She now ships cakes across 3 states. In all these stories, there was a turning point when the person said, "Enough." I had reached mine. But change doesn't come without challenge. Mike's retaliation wasn't just about pride, it was about control. When I refused to make dinner for him and Susan, he weaponized guilt. He'd suddenly become too tired to manage the household. "You think working a real job will be easier than this?" he scoffed. "Let's see how long you last." But what he didn't understand was that his words, meant to wound, only fueled me. I started journaling every day, my goals, my setbacks, and most importantly, my small wins. Like the first time Annie said she wanted to be strong like Mommy, or the first time I earned enough from a side job to buy her a little cake, no permission or groveling required. Susan, on the other hand, started to unravel. Without me managing her day-to-day needs, she quickly realized how much she had relied on the very person she had spent years tearing down. Her outbursts grew more frequent, more desperate. She once even tried to bribe me back, saying, "We'll increase your budget, just come home and do what you used to do." I refused, because now I understood the cost of that arrangement, my peace, my dignity, my daughter's view of what love looks like. The message I was sending Annie was louder than any lecture. We do not shrink ourselves for people who refuse to see our worth. By week's end, I had lined up a trial assignment, live-in caregiving for a woman with similar needs to Susan, but who at least had the decency to pay well. $7,000 per month, more than 4 times what Mike used to begrudge me. The interview was odd, formal, clinical, but respectful. Miss Lucy, the woman's daughter, looked over my resume and said, "Your experience is personal, but that kind of resilience can't be taught." That night, I called her back. "I accept the job," I said, "and I'll bring my daughter with me if that's all right." She agreed. A win. A beginning. But of course, in Mike and Susan's house, peace wasn't allowed. Just as I started to breathe again, Susan launched her final tantrum, culminating in a tragic accident that would change everything. And just like that, what began as a fight for respect would turn into a crime scene, and I'd find myself at the center of a headline no one could have predicted. The fallout from the tragedy was swift, surreal, and irreversible. As Mike's lifeless body was wheeled into the emergency room, I stood frozen under the blinding hospital lights. A woman beside me murmured, "Is that her husband?" And I realized people were already whispering. Susan's scream echoed through the corridors, high-pitched, agonizing, and irrational. "You killed my son, you witch! You stole him from me!" She clawed at the nurses, her wheelchair spinning uncontrollably. But I didn't flinch. I'd spent years absorbing her venom. This time, I let it slide off me like rain on armor. I was numb, yes, but I was also clearer than ever. I didn't kill Mike. Susan's rage, her temper, her refusal to accept consequences had ended her son's life. That mug wasn't just an object. It was the physical embodiment of decades of entitlement, disrespect, and unchecked anger. But in her mind, she needed someone to blame. People like Susan never accept they were the architect of their own downfall. I wasn't going to argue. I just quietly completed the necessary paperwork, signed where needed, and left. There was a funeral to plan, a daughter to comfort, and a life to rebuild again. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Instead of spiraling into grief, I felt strangely free. Not because Mike had died, but because the final tie that bound me to that toxic household had been severed. My therapist, yes, I finally got one, said something that stayed with me. It's not uncommon to feel relief when an abusive dynamic ends, even if it ends tragically. And it was true. With Mike gone and Susan paralyzed by guilt, rage, and physical limitation, the narrative finally shifted. I was no longer the villain in someone else's story. I was the survivor in my own. Legally, things moved quickly. As Mike's widow, Annie and I inherited part of the estate. Susan retained her share, and I, despite every reason to walk away, allowed her to keep the house. Why? Because I wanted closure, not revenge. And perhaps because I knew exactly what kind of future that house would bring her. A cage of her own making. Sure enough, her relatives came like moths to flame. The promise of inheritance was too tempting for the extended family she had once dismissed. Her maternal nephew moved in, full of smiles and fake devotion. I watched from a distance as the cycle repeated. Control, entitlement, conflict. Only this time, Susan had no real power. Her body had betrayed her, and now her mind was catching up. I heard through neighbors that she started altering her will secretly, disinheriting the nephew, and leaving the house to Annie and instead. Not out of love, of course, out of spite. She didn't want her nephew to win. And that's when it hit me. Susan never operated from love. Everything she did was transactional, power-based. She valued control more than connection. But life doesn't reward that forever. In her final years, she was a prisoner in her own empire, surrounded by people waiting for her to die, mistrusting everyone, even the caregivers she hired. By the time she passed, she had no one left to mourn her, no one to wipe her tears or speak kindly to her. I handled her funeral because it was the right thing to do, not for her, but for Annie. When Annie grows up and asks about her grandmother, I'll tell her the truth, but also show her that we honored life, even if the person in question failed to honor ours. Annie inherited the house. I sold it. With the proceeds, we moved to a quiet suburb where no one knew our story, a place where we could start fresh. I opened a small business helping other women who had been full-time caregivers return to work. It wasn't flashy, but it was meaningful. I called it Second Wind. Clients came in hesitant, ashamed, unsure, but they left with resumes, references, and most importantly, confidence. Every time I helped a woman get hired after years of feeling invisible, I remembered the day I walked into the agency and said, "I'm ready." And every time Annie hugged me goodnight in our little rented home, I knew I'd made the right choice, not just in leaving, but in choosing self-worth over survival. Sometimes liberation doesn't come with applause or justice. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a long exhale after years of holding your breath. That's what this chapter of my life felt like. Not victory, not revenge, but relief. A soft landing after a long, hard fall. 3 months passed after I sold the house and started over. Annie had adjusted surprisingly well. Children are more resilient than we think, but I also believe her strength came from finally living in a home without shouting, without tears, without being caught between chaos and silence. Our new place was modest, but it felt like a mansion compared to what we left behind. Clean, sunlit rooms, a small garden Annie loved to water every morning, and most importantly, peace. That peace gave me the space to do something I had never truly done before: forgive myself. For all the years I stayed, for all the times I didn't fight back, for not recognizing sooner that love isn't measured by endurance. I once thought that staying made me strong, but I now know that walking away required far more courage. At Second Wind, the career center I founded, I met dozens of women like me. Women who had raised families, supported husbands, cared for in-laws, and then found themselves discarded when they were no longer useful. One client, Marie, broke down in tears during her first interview. She had been a full-time caregiver for her late husband's father for 9 years, and when he passed, her husband filed for divorce. No job, no income, no fallback. "I don't know who I am without them," she whispered. I hugged her and said, "You're someone with 9 years of experience in patience, strength, and empathy, skills this world undervalues until it's desperate for them." We helped her get placed as a supervisor at a senior home. Within 2 months, she was promoted. Within 4, she had moved into her own apartment. Marie's story became the poster for our center, not her photo, but her journey. A woman who found power after being dismissed, just like I had. Meanwhile, Susan's story reached me in pieces, scattered like ash through the gossip of neighbors and social media threads. The nephew she once trusted had pawned off her antique furniture, taken control of her bank account, and tried to place her in a care facility with the cheapest rate he could find. He had expected wealth, control, status, but he hadn't expected a legal battle. Because even though Susan had altered her will in Annie's favor, she hadn't given the nephew legal guardianship over her finances. Her lawyer, perhaps the only wise choice she'd made, intervened on Annie's behalf. When I received the official notice that Susan had passed, I didn't feel much. No hatred, no gloating, just a strange stillness, like the closing of a heavy door. I brought Annie to her final viewing, not because I thought Susan deserved a farewell, but because I wanted Annie to understand death, not as something to fear, but as a reminder to live better while we still can. Annie stood quietly by the casket, holding a small flower. Then, with her soft voice, she said, "I hope you feel better now, Grandma." That was it. No bitterness, just the quiet kindness of a child who had already learned compassion far beyond her years. I often wonder what Annie will remember when she's older. Will she recall the fights, the cold meals, the silence after screens? Or will she remember how I stood up for us, rebuilt a life, turned dust into foundation? I can't control memory, but I can shape the example. So every morning, I get up before the sun, make breakfast, pack Annie's lunch, and head to the center. I help women type resumes, walk them through interviews, teach them how to talk about the work they've done with pride. Because housework is work, emotional labor is labor, and love, when used as currency, becomes a form of debt no one deserves. I may not be wealthy, I may not own mansions or businesses, but I have something far more valuable: my self-respect, my daughter's trust, and a life that feels like mine. That's a legacy I'm proud to build. 6 months after launching Second Wind, the small career support center I'd started with borrowed furniture, volunteer mentors, and a used coffee maker, something unexpected happened. We were contacted by a local news station. They had caught wind of our mission to help women like me, mothers, wives, daughters-in-law, who had been invisible for too long. The journalist, a woman named Eliza, sat across from me with her notepad and microphone and asked, "What made you start this?" I thought back to the broken plates, to Susan's insults, to Mike's silence, and then to the day I handed my resume to a stranger and said, "I used to be someone." Then I looked at her and said, "Because I never want another woman to feel like she's just a servant in her own life." That line went viral. Within a week, donations came flooding in, offers to collaborate. Former clients began volunteering at the center. The community that once ignored us began to see us. But visibility brought something else: Mike's family. It started with a call from one of his cousins, someone I hadn't heard from in years. She spoke in a syrupy voice, the kind laced with manipulation. "Mandy, we just saw your interview. You're such an inspiration. We always knew you were too good for the chaos in that house. We were wondering if we could discuss Susan's estate." I paused for a moment, then replied flatly, "There's nothing to discuss. Everything has been handled legally." Right, she said quickly. "It's just, well, some of us feel like Annie doesn't really need that house. You're doing well now. Maybe you'd consider—" I hung up before she could finish. I had learned to spot snakes even when they wore smiles. Days later, another letter arrived, this time from Susan's maternal niece, demanding access to the house out of respect for family history. Respect? I thought. Susan hadn't respected me. Why did they think I owed them anything? But this wasn't about hate. It was about boundaries, about showing my daughter that being kind doesn't mean being weak. So I did what I always did. I documented, I filed, I responded through lawyers. No more arguing, no more screaming. Just quiet, firm power. That same month, Annie brought home a drawing from school. It was a picture of our house, just the two of us in front of it, smiling, flowers all around. Above it, she had written, "Me and Mommy's home. No yelling." I cried, not because it was sad, but because it was everything. That little house, purchased with the proceeds from Susan's will and the settlement, had become a sanctuary. A place where Annie didn't have to hide in her room. A place where meals were shared without fear. At the center, our team had grown to 14 women. Most of them had been housewives, caregivers, or women fired from jobs for being too old, too outspoken, or too tired looking. And yet, they had become powerhouse trainers, coordinators, counselors. We had helped over 300 women by then, some now in law offices, others in bakeries, many in homes finally being paid for the work they had always done for free. One woman, Gloria, had cared for her in-laws for 17 years without a single thank you. Now she manages 3 locations of a professional caregiving service. She told me last week, "I don't need an apology anymore. I got a paycheck and my pride back." I nodded. That's the goal. Not revenge, renewal. But still, every now and then, when someone tries to test me, when someone whispers, "You should have just endured it for your daughter," I smile and say, "I did it because of my daughter." Strength isn't just about how much you can carry. Sometimes, years passed. Annie grew taller, wiser, and more confident with each passing season. She often told me, with a sparkle in her eyes, "Mom, you're the strongest person I know." And every time she said it, I felt a mixture of pride and humility, because strength isn't about having all the answers. It's about making hard decisions even when your voice shakes. I was no longer just a woman who had escaped an unloving husband and a toxic household. I was now a community figure. Schools called me to speak about emotional resilience. Local organizations invited me to mentor survivors of domestic and emotional abuse. People knew my story not because it was dramatic, but because it was true and far too common. One summer afternoon, Annie and I stood in the garden of our small home, now surrounded by plants and soft wind chimes. "Mom," she said, "what do you think Dad would say if he saw us now?" I paused for a moment, then answered, "He'd probably try to take credit for your strength." Annie laughed and said, "But we know the truth." Yes, we do. One of the final chapters of closure came when I attended a conference on women's economic independence. I gave a talk titled From Invisible to Invincible. I shared stories, not just mine, but stories of the women from our center, from those who now managed businesses, raised their children alone with pride, and rebuilt their confidence brick by brick. After my speech, a woman approached me. She was in her early 60s, thin-framed glasses, calloused hands that told stories of labor. She said, "I wasted 40 years waiting for someone to notice me. Your story lit a fire in me. It's not too late, is it?" I shook my head. It's never too late to stop surviving and start living. She smiled and left, but her words echoed for days. I often thought about how many women were still stuck, trapped in their homes, guilted into silence, told to be patient, to be good wives, to endure. And I made it my mission to reach as many as possible. We partnered with legal advisors, therapists, and shelters. We created an emergency response fund for women who needed to leave abusive situations. And we launched a podcast titled The Price of Silence, where women told their stories anonymously to let others know they weren't alone. Mandy, the woman who once begged for a few $100s to take her daughter to the doctor, was now advocating for financial independence and self-worth on every platform she could. And Mike? Gone, buried, his legacy buried with him. Susan's name faded into the quiet corners of memory. Occasionally, a new client at the center would say, "You remind me of someone I used to know, strong but kind." I never told them about the mug or the fall or the years of unpaid labor. I just smiled and said, "We all have stories that taught us who we are, and that's what this story is really about. Not revenge, not punishment, but transformation." In 2025, as we navigate an increasingly fast-paced world where gender roles are still debated and expectations still weigh heavily on women's shoulders, let Mandy's story be a reminder that every single one of us has the right to choose dignity over survival. You don't need permission to reclaim your life. You don't need validation to walk away from what breaks you. And you certainly don't need to shrink to make others feel powerful. Whether you're a mother, a daughter, a wife, or just someone tired of being dismissed, this is your time. Don't wait for someone to rescue you. Be your own revolution. Because when one woman rises, she carries 100 others with her. And that changes the world. The story of Mandy is not just a cautionary tale about domestic inequality. It is a manifesto for self-respect, agency, and reclaiming personal power in a world that still too often undervalues women's emotional labor. In 2025, when discussions about gender equality are louder than ever, but many traditional expectations still persist silently in homes across the globe, Mandy's transformation holds crucial lessons for every individual, especially those caught between societal roles and personal fulfillment. The lesson is simple but profound. The moment you stop tolerating disrespect, your entire life begins to shift. Mandy spent years as an unpaid, unappreciated caregiver, told repeatedly that she was lucky to be supported while she sacrificed her career, her time, her peace, and ultimately her sense of self. But when she chose to walk away from that system of exploitation, she discovered something powerful, that even if the world calls you replaceable, your integrity makes you irreplaceable. In a modern world where many still believe that money equates to authority and control, Mandy showed that emotional strength, resilience, and wisdom carry a far higher value. Applying this lesson to life in 2025 means refusing to allow yourself to be defined by what others give or deny you. Whether you're a stay-at-home parent, a full-time worker, or both, the value of your presence and labor, physical, emotional, or mental, must be recognized first by you. Because if you don't believe in your own worth, those who benefit from your silence never will. In a gig economy where people are more mobile and independent than ever before, Mandy's pivot from being Mike's wife to a self-employed caregiver earning $7,000 a month is proof that skills honed in silence can become strengths in the spotlight, if you're brave enough to step into it. It teaches us that we must stop waiting for external permission to pursue financial independence, self-worth, or emotional peace. Whether you're in a marriage, a family structure, or even a toxic work environment, the first and most urgent step is identifying what you've been tolerating and asking why. In Mandy's case, her tolerance wasn't born of weakness, it was born of conditioning. She was taught that endurance was noble, that asking for more made her difficult, that love was best expressed in sacrifice. But in 2025, as younger generations push for mental health awareness, relationship equity, and work-life balance, Mandy's journey is a bridge between old and new paradigms. It shows us that being a good wife or a good daughter-in-law should never mean being invisible. For women who still bear the weight of emotional labor without gratitude or compensation, Mandy's story is a call to action. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. Say no. Walk away. Choose yourself. Because nothing changes if nothing changes. But for men, too, there's a deep lesson here. Mike's downfall wasn't just about being a bad husband. It was about his arrogance, his refusal to empathize, and his blind trust that power without respect would hold forever. In a world where relationship dynamics are rapidly evolving, emotional intelligence is no longer optional, it's essential. And for children like Annie, the most powerful example is watching a parent rise instead of break. In the end, this story is not about revenge, it's about recalibration. It's about rewriting the story of what a family dynamic should be, built on respect, shared responsibility, and mutual growth. So in 2025 and beyond, let Mandy's arc be a mirror. What have you tolerated for too long? Where are you shrinking to make others comfortable? And when will you stop asking for permission to be whole? The answer begins the moment you decide that your peace, your power, and your dignity are non-negotiable. That's when your real life begins.